Okay, continuing in Chapter 5, Objectivism, Anarcho-Capitalism, and the Effects of Psychedelics on Faith and Freedom. So, the nascent Libertarian movement argued over compulsory taxation, the morality of the Cold War, and such recondite, and he uses that word a lot. When you use an unusual word a lot, it gets very noticeable. Should have used perhaps obscure or abstruse. Free market economics debates as the gold standard versus managed central banking, passing around and ruthlessly editing suggested reading lists for the proper understanding of individualist ideas and history. But Ayn Rand was no longer contributing her barbed ex-cathedras into the fray. She had removed herself from the organizations and controversies of her fellow individualists after Leonard Read and Fee disappointed her over the Friedman-Stigler rent control pamphlet. She had not, though, removed herself from the fight for liberty as she waged it, through art and through a rigorously developed philosophy consistent with the facts of reality. And she spent the last years of the 1940s and most of the 50s working on what was to become Atlas Shrugged, the ultimate melding of her art and philosophy. It says, while Rand clearly spoke in the name of peace, liberty, and achievement, though her ideological enemies have rarely granted her the respect of noticing that's what she explicitly stood for, the novel supplies plenty of ammunition to those who accuse it of being written in the spirit of hate. Now, I've never heard anyone say it was written in the spirit of hate. I've heard people say it was simplistic in its depiction of the enemies of capitalism. But I think they kind of missed the artistic point there, because it's also simplistic in its portrayals of the heroes. It's meant to be archetypical. It's meant to be a pastiche of the characteristics of the type of people she's trying to represent. Said she had given up on conservatives and the conservative movement, and she saw herself as a radical for capitalism. She was unalterably opposed to Mises's and Hazlitt's utilitarian ethics. And I'm not a fan of utilitarian ethics either, though obviously the conclusions those two men came to were spot on. Very dry air here today. Though she tended to be soft on Mises as a person. In September 1954, and this is going to go into the very, at least to me, probably not to others, odd relationship between, it's not even odd, it's more the kind of cold, calculating nature of the relationship in some ways between Nathaniel Branden and Ayn Rand. Remember, both Nathaniel and Ayn were married to other people. So in 1954, the implicit became explicit. Rand and Nathaniel announced to Frank and Barbara, their respective spouses, that by the logic of who they were and the Randian theory of romantic love, love arises from the search to possess the human who most exemplifies your highest values. They were in love and would require some time alone together each week. The arrangement was initially non-sexual, but that changed by the beginning of 1955, also explained beforehand to their spouses. Alrighty, to each their own. And then he's quoting Ayn. Atlas was a cry to the culture. May I find real-life embodiments of the men I write about. Its immense mass popularity was all well and good, but Rand wanted approbation from men of influence and accomplishment, from men of achievement whose judgment of her work and love for it merited her respect. She was too much the elitist to be satisfied by mere bestsellerdom. That respect was not quick in coming. Atlas declared that the dominant cultural, philosophic, political, and artistic trends were the prelude to mass death and the complete collapse of civilization. Rand insisted that the enemies of her philosophy were in fact death worshippers, and sniveling and weak ones at that. This did not, strangely, endear her to the culture barons. They struck back the only way they could, with cynical contempt and total incomprehension. Now, Nathaniel Branden goes on to describe her as very morally severe, very moralistic, and very much concerned with matters of personal loyalty. But skipping ahead a tiny bit, the author of the book says some think, and Branden's memoir gives some credence to this, that he was much more of a moralistic terror than was Rand herself. It says Rand became a genuine public phenomenon, particularly on college campuses where, in the 1960s, she was as much a part of the cultural landscape as Tolkien, Salinger, or Vonnegut, though because of her outre political orientation, she is rarely mentioned in the same breath with them. She could attract over 1,000 people to see her on rare trips to Los Angeles, and her annual Ford Hall Forum talks in Boston usually filled the hall and overflowed into other rooms where people huddled to listen over loudspeakers. Rand demanded nearly complete, but not to say thoughtless, obedience from her inner circle. Branden reports Rand telling him, "If by your own statement I am the highest, most consistent embodiment of your values, then I expect your first consideration always to be given to me." Oof. Oof. Big oof. I expect not just you, but the whole collective, to make me their highest loyalty, so far as any other people are concerned, if it ever comes to a conflict. Otherwise, what do you mean the principle of loyalty to one's values means? In his 1989 memoir, Branden admitted, with regret, the cultish nature of objectivism in the 1960s, and wrote of the implicit premises of Rand's inner circle, which we transmitted to our students at the Nathaniel Branden Institute. And here's the list of the implicit premises. Ayn Rand is the greatest human being who has ever lived. Atlas Shrugged is the greatest human achievement in the history of the world. Ayn Rand, by virtue of her philosophical genius, is the supreme arbiter in any issue pertaining to what is rational, moral, or appropriate to man's life on earth. Once one is acquainted with Ayn Rand and her work, the measure of one's virtue is intrinsically tied to the position one takes regarding her and/or it. No one can be a good objectivist who does not admire what Ayn Rand admires and condemn what Ayn Rand condemns. Since Ayn Rand has designated Nathaniel Branden as her intellectual heir and has repeatedly proclaimed him to be an ideal exponent of her philosophy, he is to be accorded only marginally less reverence than Ayn Rand herself. But it is best not to say most of these things explicitly, excepting perhaps the first two items. One must always maintain that one arrives at one's beliefs solely by reason. That's a cult. Right? I'm going to, again, I like to break this up into recording sessions. I'm terribly dehydrated. It's fall just hit here, temperature-wise, and I've got a heater going on. I think that's what's just really drawing out the air. Alrighty, continuing. To Rand, everything depends on three unquestionable axiomatic primaries, which you cannot deny without affirming, Almost sounds like Hoppe's argumentation ethics. Existence, identity, and consciousness. Like Mises, she deduces her philosophy from necessary truths. But unlike Mises, her bedrock, unquestionable truth was ontological, rooted in the very nature of reality, not just a function of how the human mind and human action work. To Rand, politics can't come first. It is impossible, she thought, to effectively fight collectivism without attacking altruism, its moral base, and equally impossible to defeat altruism without first striking against irrationalism, its epistemological base. And the ultimate irrationalism is denying that existence exists. That is, a thing is what it is. That is A is A. And again, there's been reams of digital ink spilled over her attacks on altruism. I don't agree with her on that particular issue. In fact, find denial of altruism as irrational to be repugnant. Thus, Rand reasoned, the proper value for a living being is its own life. If your life is the ultimate value, certain other values are integral means to that end: reason, purpose, and self-esteem. You cannot survive without using reason to grasp the nature of the world around you. Nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. And because a human being must be free to use his mind and to homestead property as per Locke, a reality-rooted political ethic says that no man ought to interfere with another's ability to think, act, and appropriate property, and freely trade that property once justly obtained. That is the basics of how Rand derives her libertarian conception of human rights. Some rights scoffers have pointed out that Rand, in the context of attacking welfare statism and forced income redistribution, said that a need is not a claim, and then based her whole view of human rights on the fact that man needs other men to respect them in order to survive and thrive. I'm sure other people have dealt with this ably, but that criticism is quite shallow. Man, Rand notes, is an essentially moral animal. If he thinks something is right, he is willing to put up with enormous practical hardships to pursue it. This, she thought, is where Mises and other economist defenders of liberty went wrong. They thought people only need to understand that collectivism and statism don't work, don't deliver the goods. Rand knew that people don't care if something doesn't work as long as the dominant morality of altruism tells them that it is right. Disagreeing with her, saying that altruism is necessarily the dominant morality, but I do agree with her that people don't care if something works if they've been conditioned and the culture around them teaches them that something is right, which is why we need to shift the dominant culture. And I wanted to go back to a need is not a claim, and why I said that argument was weak, where they said if man needs other men not to commit violence against them in order to survive, doesn't that defeat her whole purpose or whole statement of a need is not a claim? Perhaps her statement there is abbreviated too much. A mere need is not a claim. Now, a need can be part of a claim, but merely because someone needs something does not mean they can claim it. There is much more to the idea that violence, that aggression against other people is wrong than merely the need. It can actually go back to argumentation ethics as well. Okay, and now this title of the subchapter warmed my little anarchist heart. It says, for me, there was only one choice: to go on to anarchism. I feel you. I feel you, Murray. And here's where that quote comes from. A dovetailing of practical and ethical stances is exceedingly common, almost universal amongst all varieties of political thinking. But it was ultimately considerations of ethics and justice that led Rothbard to reject the state entirely. Rothbard was embroiled in one of his usual debates over his free market radicalism, he recalled, when his interlocutors asked him a question. If a social contract can justify a legitimate minimal state, then why can't society also agree to have a government build steel mills and have price controls and whatever? At that point, I realized that the laissez-faire position is terribly inconsistent, and I either had to go on to anarchism or become a statist. Of course, for me, there was only one choice. That's to go on to anarchism. Leonard Read's bold, heretical declaration in his book Government, an Ideal Concept, that citizens can be forced to pay taxes for their own protection engendered a cross-national flood of anger, revealing the tensions that existed between the anarchists and minarchists, those who believed in a minimal government restricted to protecting citizens' life and property against force and fraud. The term minarchist to describe such libertarians entered the movement vocabulary a decade or more later, courtesy of movement gadfly Samuel Konkin. In terms of significant power centers, the anarchists had the minarchists outnumbered and included most of the Volcker Fund's officers, and it goes on to say some others, but I did not realize that at the time. Certainly is not the case today. I wish it were. It says the libertarian movement in the 1950s was not a purely constitutionalist limited government gang of respectable patriots. Anarchism was woven intricately and thickly throughout it. Ayn Rand and Isabel Patterson remained dedicated to their limited state, and Rose Wilder Lane vacillated between anarchism and statism, though she identified herself as an anarchist on occasion. Rothbard was already tiring of Fee's lack of radicalism, but given its role in introducing him to these budding young anarchists, he thought it did have its uses, as long as youngsters didn't get trapped at a Fee-level understanding of libertarianism. Others in the Fee circle felt the same aversion to National Review. A one-time chairman of Fee's Board of Trustees wrote Buckley upon reading the first issue that, "I have a little bit the fear that too much attention may be paid to being anti-communist and not enough to being against communism." Most right-wing intellectuals struck Rothbard as having a shallow understanding of true human liberty and defending it timidly, and the right-wing masses were in some ways worse than the intellectuals. And then it says, quote, "The right-wing masses care little and know nothing about liberty or economics. They are for Christ and the Constitution, and they are against foreigners, communists, atheists, and Jews." Okay, we are going to stop there and do another upload. The Buckleyite right positioned itself as the snide older brother to the more radical and irresponsible libertarian individualists, even though when it came to anti-statism, most of his crew of former communists were Johnny-come-latelys compared to the Fee circle. Buckley mocked what he saw as the libertarians' effete and useless disengagement from the Cold War, scoffing at them for shuffling off from serious geopolitics to their little intellectual seminars on demunicipalizing garbage removal. In 1963, Fee Board Chairman E.W. Dykes, an Ohio architect, responded to this line of attack by taking Buckley's critique for a given and defending libertarians on those seemingly outrageous terms. War is the culmination of the breaking of libertarian principles, not once, but thousands of times. We are challenged to jump in at this point and apply our principles to get out of the unholy mess built up over years and years of error on errors. I suggest it would be a very little different challenge had he posed this proposition. You are a second lieutenant. Your platoon is surrounded. Your ammunition is gone. 2 of your squad leaders are dead. The 3rd is severely wounded. Now, Mr. Libertarian, let's see you get out of this one with your little seminars. My answer? Demunicipalize the garbage service. Now wait, don't give up on me as a nut yet. I have a point. That second lieutenant is a goner. And so is the prospect of a lasting peace until man learns why it is wrong to municipalize the garbage service. You can't apply libertarian principles to wrong things at their culmination and expect to make much sense. It is too fundamental. You have to start back at the very beginning, and that is precisely what our little seminars are for. There are people who build for tomorrow. There are people who build for a year. There are people who look forward a generation. The libertarian, a part of the remnant, takes the long view. He is looking forward to the time when war will be looked upon as we now look on cannibalism, a thing of the past. What do we do in our little seminars? We make the case for freedom, which cannot coexist with interventionism. Again, I say, we will never end wars until we at least understand why the garbage service should be removed from the jurisdiction of the police force. That is the government. And that is such a brilliant point. And I think I am actually going to record this section as its own little video on the main channel, because this is such an important point and I don't want to forget it. So I am looking for like a post-it or something I could flag this page with so I don't forget to do that. Looks like I spilled Mountain Dew or something all over these post-its. They're all crinkly, but let's just stick that right there. All right. Seeing if I didn't do that, I would have forgotten about it already. Okay, continuing. In addition to butting heads with the Buckley right, Rothbard and at least half of the Circle Bastiat, which is what he called his like inner circle of anarchists that he ran around and raised hell with, had the distinction of being among the first to get purged from Ayn Rand's objectivist circle. He saw in her thinking a belief in one rational purpose that all men ought to share, which to him implied that human individuality was to be shamed, that everyone should basically be the same perfectly rational, objective man. And that's the same objection I have. It seems very collectivist and squashing of individuality. But when Atlas came out, Rothbard, despite his bad experiences with Rand, adored it. He thanked her for leading him in the direction of natural rights thinking, since he had always felt that was one thing the strictly utilitarian Misesian edifice lacked. Reading Atlas had made him a better person, and he no longer laughed at the Randians as cultists for declaring her one of the greatest minds of all time. As Rothbard recalls it, after a couple of months, he and most of the circle found Brandon's officiousness and humorlessness aggravating and laughable. He began noticing political deviations in Rand that he found hard to take, particularly her refusal to realize that the logical and moral corollary of voluntary taxation, which she did believe in, was private anarchist justice, in which the need for adjudication and protection were provided by private businesses in a competitive free market, which she rejected violently. One night, back at the Rothbards' apartment, the circle's usual jackanapes turned toward an impromptu skit imitating Rand and Brandon attempting to convince a young woman, a therapy client of Brandon's, that following the Brandon-Rand line would guarantee her happiness. Word of this mockery, daring to make light of the designated right-hand mind to the most brilliant woman of all time, got back to Brandon. War was on the horizon. And Rand, it turns out, had a really dim view of Immanuel Kant, who is a philosopher that I happen to enjoy very much. And she said on Kant, that philosophical supervillain who Rand maintained deliberately set out to destroy the human mind. Rothbard shared with correspondent Carrie Thornley that, I seriously question whether anyone outside of Dr. Fu Manchu and other such sources for Randian aesthetics ever set out deliberately to destroy the human mind. Power and Market is Rothbard's first thorough defense and explanation of how market anarchism would work. I have never read that. I'm just looking here I like to have an idea of where we are going. As I said, this is a long chapter. Okay, just getting a feel here. He then launches into one of the most difficult parts of anarchist theory, an explanation of how a truly libertarian society would extend free markets even to personal defense. Many argue that defense of property and person is a necessary precondition of a free market, and thus it cannot be handled by a free market. After all, everyone needs defense, right? Similarly, everyone needs food, but that doesn't mean the government must supply it as a necessary precondition for a free market to function. That argument about defense, Rothbard argues, requires denying the notion of marginality in economics, the first insight from the Austrian School of Economics founder Karl Menger and others that explained why unnecessary diamonds are more valuable than vital water. We must not treat defense as one unitary good that we either have or don't have, but as something whose marginal services can be bought. We can't buy a whole justice system, but we can hire the services of an arbiter to adjudicate our personal disputes. We can't buy the police, but can hire someone to defend our property or track down some miscreant who has wronged us. Having established the idea that a free market can supply anything human beings need, Rothbard goes on to analyze and critique the various types of state intervention. He defends a libertarian class analysis derived from an early 19th century American vice president, senator, congressman, and political philosopher, John Calhoun. The idea that the real classes in contemporary society are not boss and worker, but taxpayer, those who are mulcted by the state, I have to look that word up, and tax consumer, those who gain through the state's organized theft. So mulcted, M-U-L-C-T-E-D. Never seen that word before. And I like learning new words, which I'm doing a lot of in this book. Mulc. Extract money from by fine or taxation. Okay. Simple enough. Rothbard disposes of the free rider problem, the notion that suppliers of some goods, such as defense, cannot ensure that they collect payment from all those who benefit without a taxing power, essentially by asking, who cares? That had always been my conclusion, and I never read this of him. I'm glad I've been somewhat vindicated in thinking, like, why is this a problem? Now, here's interesting part of history. Religion and libertarianism, there's such a hostile relationship, it seems, in today's Libertarian Party with this. So here's a piece of history I didn't know about, and apparently many people don't know about. When talking about libertarian institutions in the movement's early days, who can forget spiritual mobilization? Everyone, it seems. But in the early 1950s, Leonard Read and his Fee crew and their general universe of funders and supporters saw this pamphleteering group of libertarian outreachers to Protestant clergy and to those who listened to Protestant clergy as one of their most significant peers. But few among even the highest echelons of active movement libertarianism remember spiritual mobilization today. Part of the reason, and I think this is the case, and I think we still see this in the LP today, may be a residual after effect of Ayn Rand's fiercely atheistic legacy to the movement. She laid brick after brick on a mighty wall of separation between libertarianism and religion. And I would say she did more than that. She laid brick by brick a mighty wall of hostility. But spiritual mobilization, which reached more people with more radical libertarian ideas than any other group, and what a claim, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, was an explicitly religious educational group. Its official name was Mobilization for Spiritual Ideals, but it was better known in shorthand as Spiritual Mobilization. And it had a flagship publication called Faith and Freedom. It says, unlike many of their compatriots on the Christian right, Faith and Freedom did not focus on foreign enemies or conscience conspirators, but rather, in the classic Fee style, on the mistaken ideas that underlay the communist menace. They knew the fight for true liberalism had more fronts and would stretch longer than any single presidential election, that socialism had crept into American life before FDR, and that in the nature of things, the libertarian ought not to let the political events of the day either plunge him into gloom or propel him to jubilance. However, the editors and writers of Faith and Freedom, which I should look up copies of that, were far more radically libertarian than their audience. Okay, that will be it for this recording segment, at least. Well, crap. Okay. All right, as you can tell, it's a different day, and I'm continuing here. Read's sense of the divine was vague and gaseous. That's an interesting way to put it. Although Read and Fee have kept a reputation as a beachhead of traditional religiosity and morality in a sometimes antinomian and libertarian movement, Read's sense of religion was more mystical than Christian. He once wrote to R.C. Hoyles, "I assume you consider the Bible as much and as little an authority as I do. What then is authority? Where does it reside? In my case, it is my own judgment, the results of my own free will." He was no atheist or materialist, but far more a seeker of spiritual truth than someone confident he had found them in a Western tradition. Now it's moving towards the psychedelics part of the title of this chapter. Mullendore found LSD a fascinating tool, talking of its wonders like a true electric utility man. LSD steps up our voltage and frequency. To use the new vision thus made available, one must be able to plug in, get in tune, to harmonize with this new environment which LSD opens for us to correspond with. Mullendore's son-in-law, Louis Demlow, was a huge LSD enthusiast by the early 1960s, and his reaction to it sums up the interesting way this squad of spiritually seeking, high bourgeois industrialists and professionals lived out a first wave of psychedelic adventurism before the more populist one of the mid to late 1960s. Demlow wrote a friend about how LSD, rather than making him drop out in Timothy Leary's sense, made him even more intensely but pleasurably and lovingly and awarely focused on his business, his children and their schooling, and his everyday life. It affected his business philosophy toward the solvent company he worked at. He decided they must help each employee to be as free as an individual and respect his right to choose his own way toward perfection. Any sort of active presence in the libertarian movement was over for the people and organizations from California who became enmeshed in herd, psychedelics, and the quest for spiritual enlightenment. Mullendore was still writing lectures warning of economic apocalypse to friends, but Ashby and Inger Bretson were lost to the movement. Spiritual mobilization petered out in 1961. Its corporate supporters from the Midwest withdrew as the 1950s wore on, uneasy with Inger Bretson's new turn and seeing little energy or activity with Faith and Freedom appearing only sporadically, and the radio show and newspaper column dead. Inge Bretson shifted his attention toward being a full-time New Ager, convinced he was a hermetic avatar of sorts after his Christopher experience and sponsored retreats at his new 270-acre Mount San Jacinto hideaway for Sufis, depth psychologists, and Tai Chi masters. Rothbard just shook his head sadly. This inner spiritual liberty thing was nonsense. There was a state to smash, right here in the material world. The spiritualism and psychedelics had drawn away some comrades, and his cause was weakened. Next, it goes on to talk about the phenomena of eye pencil, which if you haven't seen or read, there's a video and a little pamphlet. It is incredible. And it says, underlying Reed's entire project was always the belief, as any old sensei might tell you, that there is no changing the world, there is only changing ourselves. Reed wants us, and then he talks about how Reed contemplated the pencil, then came up with this, and says Reed wants us all to look into any object, any window, any pencil, any day, and see manifest not only the unimaginable wonders of God's creation, but also the ineffable glories of the free market's spontaneous productive order. The essay is absurd, profound, and all-around bravura performance. It ends, I, pencil, seemingly simple though I am, offer the miracle of my creation as testimony that this faith in unfettered markets is a practical faith, as practical as the sun, the rain, a cedar tree, the good earth. And just again, flipping ahead here. So we are almost done with this chapter. We're done in this segment. The old right was dead. Rothbard knew exactly who he and his budding cadre were and detailed it in March 1956. What then are we? We are first of all radicals because A, we go to the root of things. We construct fundamental principle and follow truth wherever it leads. And B, we therefore advocate fundamental change from our present political structure. And we are libertarians because we believe in individual liberty. I used to think that we were true liberals, but I have recently come to the conclusion that it is better not to be identified with the old liberals of the 19th century. Despite their merits, they were A, great advocates of democracy and majority rule, and B, adherents of the public school system, and C, anti-clerical to the extent of banishing Jesuits, etc. Best to start afresh with the libertarian appellation, which for once we have seized from the leftist instead of vice versa. This is something else I would like to detail on my main channel, so my handy dandy post-it. It says, toward that goal, by 1961, Harper had finally convinced Harold Lushnow, chief of the Volcker Fund, to finance his dreams, a libertarian academy of sorts, an institute modeled after Princeton's Institute for Advanced Studies, in which hardcore libertarian scholars, free of day-to-day worries about teaching, academic politics, disciplinary boundaries, and publishing schedules, can indulge in the high-level, in-depth study and research on the principles of liberty that the movement needed to grow, solving hard problems, finding new arguments, extending the science of liberty to fresh areas. Rothbard and Leggio, who each could have used such an institute as a home, brainstormed the project with Harper and George Reschke, Harper's assistant. In preparation for the launch of this new project, to be called the Institute for Humane Studies, Harper wanted to figure out the best ways and identify the best people to inculcate and explore libertarianism. He polled his libertarian friends, asking them who they thought were the most effective educators for liberty. His use of the term educators is revealing about the ambitions and intentions of libertarians then, at a time when brethren on the right were beginning to hitch their star to Barry Goldwater, the cowboy senator from Arizona, the jut-jawed, steely-eyed hero who could stare down bureaucrats and communists alike and never blink. Although many of them found Goldwater encouraging, and some did not, libertarians of the early 1960s were not, in the main, advocating direct action in the political arena. They didn't really talk of making a free world, but of educating people as to the benefits of having a free world. Then individual will and initiative would take care of the rest. As 1971 rolled around, we see the convergence of those kinds of two ideas of political action and education in the Libertarian Party. Rothbard was delighted at the thought that Harper would actually get the Institute off the ground and wrote him a long memo in January 1961 explaining what he thought it ought to concentrate on, what questions it might be able to answer. Rothbard thought economics was where libertarians had gotten the farthest, between human action and his own man, economy, and state. He thought the world had about as much libertarian economic understanding as it needed. He now saw philosophy as the most important, and indeed that became one of his two big projects for the next decade, working up a fully libertarian science of ethics based on natural rights. Tricky questions involving the application of libertarian principles remained, questions that Harper's Institute could perhaps help resolve. Libertarians knew that property was the key to liberty and social peace, but there were areas, the sea, the air, matters of pollution, ideas, reputations, where it was often hard to tell exactly how property could or should be defined or protected. And libertarians needed a more sophisticated legal philosophy, examining, for example, theories of just punishment and the sort of court systems that might or could exist in a fully libertarian world. And then meta-questions of scholarship and business were important, such as how to best do research or develop a better theory of organization, e.g., can organizations coerce without violence, as in a kibbutz? They also needed histories of meeting government-dependent needs in libertarian ways, such as private canals and medieval fairs, to more fully grasp direct historical evidence that human social needs can and have been met without a state. Explorations of the history of libertarian thought that dig deeper than just Bastiat, Spencer, and Sumner were also in order. And strategy. How do we make this all work? Is there a libertarian technique for social change, a theory of conversation, say, that could illuminate how to best convert people? Is political action useful to the libertarian? Rothbard couldn't have known it, but this memo to Harper pretty much set out the agenda that self-consciously libertarian institutions and thinkers would follow from that time to this. Rothbard's head spun as he contemplated everything libertarians had to do, things that they might be able to do with the Volcker Fund's financing of Harper's dream. The late 1950s doldrums were over for the libertarian movement. But not everyone was so optimistic or forward-thinking, or forward-looking, actually. 4 years after the stunning body blow to collectivism and altruism of Atlas Shrugged, 14 years after the gathering of the highbrow brainpower of the Mont Pelerin Society, 15 years into Fee's mission of patiently and calmly explaining the benefits and glories of anything that's peaceful. 17 years after Hayek proved to a huge mass audience that state planning was the road to serfdom. 18 years after the startling 1-2-3 punch of Rand, Patterson, and Lane's bracing lessons on the glories of unbridled human energy and uncompromised free human creativity, Virgil Jordan retired from his post as chief of the National Industrial Conference Board, former home to Grant Garrett, Leonard Read, and Alan Greenspan, replied to Baldy Harper with a comment that could only ring with a chilly truth as the 1940s and the 1950s consensus of government economic management and arms races and regulation and regimentation turned more solid, more impenetrable, more omnipresent. I am sure only that education for the cause of human liberty in this country has gotten nowhere, and nobody has accomplished anything in it. And that was the longest sentence I think I have ever read. It's a whole paragraph. It's like that big in this book. I think that could have been broken up. That was very difficult to read. But so it ended on a sour note. So Rothbard's positive note and then Virgil Jordan's sour note. So that ends that chapter. The next chapter is 6, The Goldwater Movement, the Objectivist Crack-Up, and the Hippies of the Right. Let's see how many pages. Holy moly, this is a big one. This might be the longest chapter we've done. Okay, it's nearly 100 pages. It's the longest chapter we will have done. All right, we'll be starting on that next.